As I mentioned, my name is Doux. This is a picture of me, or at least it's the Bitsy sprite I use when making autobiographical and semi-autobiographical games using Bitsy. I live in Seattle with my partner, Mary-Margaret, our cat, and our toddler. And I've been making games in some form or other just about my whole life. I grew up in Georgia, and I think like a lot of kids, I made up pretend games, board games, RPGs with Legos, all that kind of stuff you make up as a kid. I have a younger brother, and I used to make up stories about Game Boy games that I had invented that I said were going to come out. I came up with all these amazing features and then inevitably made him really mad at me when I had to admit that they weren't in fact real. I became interested in programming games and making video games around middle school, and I bugged my parents to get me a book on the subject, which they did, called Game Programming for Teens, which is how I came to make my first video games in BASIC, and those have been lost to time, possibly for the best, but that's how I got started programming, and I got deeper into programming when I went to university at Georgia Tech. And then fast forwarding a bit, in 2015, I moved to Seattle to get a job in the software industry as a computer programmer. And about a year and a half later, in the fall of 2016, is when I made Bitsy. What is Bitsy exactly? I'll just do a little overview here for anyone who may not have heard of it. Like I mentioned in the title of the talk, Bitsy is a little engine for little games, worlds, and stories. You can see here a screenshot of the web interface for editing Bitsy games. Yeah, the goal of Bitsy is to make it easy to make games where you can walk around, talk to people, and be somewhere. So to that end, it's a game engine that gives you 2D tiled rooms, low-res 8x8 pixel sprites that you can interact with by bumping into, a built-in dialogue system, limited colors, only 3 per room, and also similarly limited animations, 2 frames per sprite. Just enough to give you some movement. Yeah, and this web interface here, that is at bitsy.org. So in addition to being a game engine, it's a website. It has all the tools you need to make games using this engine, and that includes editors for maps, tiles, dialogue, music, and the ability to export your games as HTML files. So you can make an entire game this way without programming experience. So there you have it. It's a game engine, it's a website, but also, and perhaps most importantly, it's a community. So I want to introduce you now to the Bitsy folk. This is the self-adopted name for the Bitsy community. And for me, the community is what, in my opinion, has made Bitsy really special. And maybe you might say that the word community gets thrown around a lot these days, but I really think that the Bitsy folk are the real deal. They have come together over not only a shared interest in Bitsy and making games, but also broadly shared values of inclusiveness, anti-bigotry, anti-capitalism, and mutual learning and support. So it's a community of folks of all ages and backgrounds that often skews younger and often queer. And it's a community from all over the world who make Bitsy games in many languages. They have created all kinds of amazing collaborations, tools, games, events, hacks, and many more things, which I will go over in more detail later in the talk. And in fact, this is a picture here of an event in 2018 at Baby Castles that showcased some Bitsy games. I'm going to introduce a little metaphor I'll be using So there's a story I liked a lot, a folktale I liked a lot growing up, which you might be familiar with, called Stone Soup. So it's just a story about some hungry travelers. They come to a village. They don't have any food to eat, but they set up a pot for soup anyway, and they put in some stones. And the villagers are curious and come over and say, "Oh, well, what are you cooking here?" And they say, "Well, we're making stone soup. If you want to try some, just come and bring your own ingredients and add to it, and then we can all share." Um, and I think, it's not an exact metaphor or anything, but it's a little bit of how I like to think of Bitsy as being this small stone that I've offered, in which an amazing group of people have come around and joined in to create a delicious stew of games and tools and so on that I will be showing you more of. But first, I want to start off by talking a little bit about why I made Bitsy. So I'm going to tell you the story how I first made Bitsy. So this all started back in 2016, which is the fall of 2016, so a little over 6 years ago now. At the time, I'd been working on a game as a side project for a couple of years. I'd played the first few acts of Kentucky Route Zero and was deeply inspired by that game. I wanted to make something like that. So this game was supposed to be this big narrative game. And I was making all my own tools for it. I had been creating this set of tools, an engine that was quite complex. It had a custom vector graphics renderer, its own skeletal animation system. I was trying to design it to be cross-platform. And the problem here was I had kind of hit a brick wall. I had created a situation where I had to make so many decisions about both the engine and the game and the story that I was just paralyzed with indecision. I wasn't able to focus on the thing that I was most interested in, which was the story and the world. Instead, I was bogged down in a lot of details. At the same time, I was working at Microsoft, taking their commuter bus from Seattle to work in Redmond. And I wanted to be able to, kill time by making games on the bus, instead of, just reading the news or something. But it was a bit awkward to pull out a whole laptop and start programming next to other people there. So I kind of wished that there was a way I could make games on my phone as easily as I could jot down ideas in my notes app. So these were the two things that kind of came together in my mind as I started working on the first version of Bitsy. I wanted a little side project from my side project that could get me unstuck, and I wanted to be able to make games on the bus. So I started working on Bitsy, and it actually started out first as just a note in my phone's note app. You can see a picture here, kind of what it looked like. I was trying to figure out what could I tap out on my phone to represent a little graphical adventure game, and that would be reasonable to type out on my phone. And so once I kind of had some ideas of, okay, I can make a small tile map. I can kind of represent some pictures here with zeros and ones. I can write out some simple dialogue for these characters to say. So once I had that, I ended up writing the actual original engine in just a weekend afternoon. So at the time, my partner, Mary-Margaret, was in grad school, and she'd fallen asleep on the couch, if memory serves. And so I had this chunk of free time with just me and some sunny fall weather and my laptop. And so I put this whole thing together, kind of hacked it together in one HTML file. I used the HTML canvas to render the game and JavaScript to write the engine logic. The initial version only supported one room with some tiles, and it didn't even have a dialogue rendering system initially. So instead of drawing the dialogue onto the screen like Bitsy does today, I just showed the dialogue via the default JavaScript alert window. So just your standard pop-up window that you can see in your browser. And the last thing I did to complete this project was hook up this web page, which I had posted on my personal website, up to a folder on my personal Dropbox account. So it could read those text files that I was typing out from there and interpret that as a game. I set up my phone's Notes app to sync to Dropbox, and so now I had rigged up a system where I could type out games on my phone and then see them update in real time on my website in my phone's browser. And this was the very first version of Bitsy. I made the first Bitsy game over the course of a few bus rides back and forth from work. It's called When I Get Home, and it is quite short, so I'm actually going to play it for you right now. You can see once the title screen goes away, you have a representation of our apartment. You can see my little avatar, which I've been using for autobiographical games ever since. And there's just a few interactable items here. So this says there's not much tea left and it's cold. Interesting, what's going on? Walk over to the couch. It's a book about pollinators. Looks like Mary-Margaret is napping on the sofa. So there's Mary-Margaret. And then in the back here, there is our cat, Totoro. He says, "I'm a bite your toes unless you feed me right, meow." So that's the whole game. And you can see a few things in this initial game I think end up becoming kind of themes or hallmarks of Bitsy games. So it's personal, it's autobiographical, it's kind of a sketch or a single scene or moment that captures an emotion, it captures a moment, and it's short, as I mentioned. Not all Bitsy games are this short, but they often are pretty short. And also, I guess another interesting thing is Bitsy games often include depictions of people's living spaces, their apartments, their houses. And it kind of makes sense since that was what it was made for, that the tool lends itself to that. Oh, and of course, there is our cat here in the back, Totoro. And this cat sprite ended up being the default sprite when you open up Bitsy Editor, and therefore ended up becoming a bit of a mascot for the engine. I made a game. Of course, I shared it with Mary-Margaret, who really liked the game. And in fact, she was interested in making her own game like this. However, Mary-Margaret is not a programmer. She wasn't interested in typing out all this game data out by hand. And I myself had to admit that it was a bit of an awkward process. And so that's how I came to make the Bitsy Editor website. I wanted to make a graphical interface for Mary-Margaret to be able to make these games. And this is a screenshot here of what that initial version of Bitsy looked like. You can see it doesn't look that different from the version that exists today, that there are less tools and less features. You only had the one room, which you could edit the tiles and sprites, and you could type out some simple dialogue. I also at this point added the ability to export the game as an HTML file, which meant you could have your game in a single file. You didn't have to somehow beam it into my Dropbox for my jerry-rigged version to read from. Yeah, so then I put this website, this editor, up on my personal website. I sent out a brief tweet about it, and I didn't really expect anything else to come of it. Of course, that's not quite what happened, but get back to that in a minute. All right, so this next bit I'm calling the stone. Remember our stone soup story. So I want to talk about, what is this stone Bitsy? What's it's made of? What are the ingredients? Bitsy obviously started as kind of a personal, somewhat idiosyncratic game engine. So by nature, it is a reflection of a lot of the personal tastes and interests that I brought to it. So I thought it would make sense to do a little tour into some of the things that inspired Bitsy. I'll start off with some video games, since this is a game engine after all. It's no surprise that games that I played and liked were some of the inspirations behind the design. I already mentioned Kentucky Route Zero was on my mind when making Bitsy, but other narrative games and walking simulators such as Gone Home and Sword and Sorcery were among a wave of games that had recently shifted my perspective on, what games are capable of. And these games had brought into focus for me the power of a part of games that I had always enjoyed, which is exploring a place and meeting its inhabitants through talking to them through the environment. I grew up playing Game Boy RPGs such as Pokemon and The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. And I think that was a part of those games too. That always was something I was really interested in. I always had an affinity for these RPG towns where you could walk around, you could learn about the history of the town. Maybe you would find a few secrets or find a character and say like, oh, there's a secret cave to the north. Oh, this town was built, because there are some spirits here that are important to the community. Things like that, things that kind of tell a story through a place, right? In addition to that, I was in the middle of playing a few games that influenced Bitsy as well. I was in the middle of playing Undertale while I was making Bitsy, which I kind of see as being a bridge between those older RPGs I talked about and those newer narrative games, and was a game that I really appreciated in terms of using space to tell a narrative, as well as hiding little jokes and details in dialogue in bits of scenes as you walk around that world. So that was something I wanted to be able to do in Bitsy. And I was also playing a lot of the game Downwell on my phone, and I was struck by how much it was able to do with its constricted 3-color palette, which was one of the inspirations behind Bitsy's constraints. And lastly, I was influenced by a lot of personal and vignette games that I'd been playing just online in various places. Games like The Graveyard by Tale of Tales, Flash games like How Do You Do It by Nina Freeman and her team, and numerous Twine games. So these had kind of opened me up to the idea that small personal experiences were worthy subjects for video games, which can be rare to find in the more mainstream industry. So getting outside of the world of games for a bit, other software that inspired my approach to designing Bitsy include Twine. I was inspired by Twine's approachable design, by the way it allowed you to make a game without programming, and also by its HTML export feature, which I already mentioned, I ended up creating something similar for Bitsy. Pico 8, the fantasy console, had been out for about a year at that point, and although I hadn't at that time used it myself, I was playing a number of games made with it, and I was inspired by the way it adopted the constraints of retro game systems as a way to inspire creativity. And beyond game software, I've always been fond of playful drawing software, such as KidPix, which is a paint program that was a favorite for me as a kid. And also, I mentioned before, notes apps and kind of the way that they are ubiquitous and always there for you to take notes, jot down ideas whenever inspiration strikes you. There's also some non-software things that I think interests of mine that inspired Bitsy. I've always been fond of toys, doll houses, dioramas. As a kid, I really liked those little Polly Pocket things. So anything where you have a little world that you can hold in your hand and explore. I love the way photography allows you to capture a moment or a feeling in a snapshot. Similarly, I feel similarly about poetry and how you can express a powerful emotion or a state of mind in just a few lines of text. And so these are interests of mine that I think played into the shape of Bitsy. And then also, I think just things in my ordinary life, the picture of Mary-Margaret and our cat Totoro in the apartment that I was trying to recreate with my first Bitsy game. And I think that desire to recreate this living space and then later our neighborhood really influenced the scale of what I was trying to make with Bitsy. I was trying to make something that fit into the scale of ordinary life. All right. So stirring the pot. That's the next section here. We're going to start talking about Bitsy folk, the community that formed around Bitsy. How did this community come to be? How did the Bitsy folk and in general users of Bitsy find Bitsy? It's a little bit tricky to answer definitively, but I will talk a bit about how I experienced this. Yeah, so here's the first tweet I made about Bitsy after I put up the web page. Put it out there, just like I put out plenty of other tweets about personal projects and games. So I didn't really expect to get much of a response, maybe a few likes from friends. Possibly one or two of them would even make a game with it. But what actually happened is somehow it found its way outside of my usual circles. Within a couple of weeks, maybe even sooner, I don't quite remember, a stranger, someone who I had never met, had tweeted a game to me that they had made with Bitsy. This was still one of the most amazing and shocking things that has ever happened to me. This is a screenshot from that game, which is called Creature Passing, created by Froach Club. It's a very cute little game. It's kind of an homage to Animal Crossing. You walk around in this little village scene and talk to various characters with little catchphrases. And it was hosted on itch.io. And you can still play it there, in fact. And itch was about to become a pretty important part of Bitsy's story and Bitsy's journey into the wider world. So things started to pick up. I started to get a couple of people a week sharing games they made with me, and I was starting to get bug reports too. At this time, I was regularly attending a game prototyping meetup in Seattle, and the organizer, Dan Cook, suggested to me that I should try out Itch's Game Jam feature and host a Bitsy Jam, which I did. This is a screenshot of the page from the Bitsy Breakfast Jam, which was the first Bitsy Jam. You can see here that the first jam had 5 entries, and then the next one had 17, and the third had almost 40. From that time on, I've run a Bitsy Jam once a month, and I think it was, especially at that initial stage, one of the ways people found Bitsy, one of the entry points into the community, because they were, seeing other people's games, bouncing ideas off of each other, and so forth. And yeah, the Bitsy Jams keep going. I keep hosting them once a month. The 66th Bitsy Jam wrapped up recently. Yeah, and meanwhile, around the same time as this, the Bitsy community were creating their own ways to find each other and learn from each other. I'll mention a couple. This is a tweet from the Bitsy Pieces Twitter account, which was created to share Bitsy games from around Twitter, so people could see what other folks were making. And this particular tweet mentions the Bitsy Talk Discord, which is probably the most significant one of these ways that the community self-organized. So the Bitsy Talk Discord channel quickly became sort of the central meeting point for the Bitsy community. and earned the nickname Bitscord. And it's been running ever since, thanks to the heroic efforts of mods, especially Candle, I think deserves a special shout out. And from the beginning of the Bitsy community did a great job of setting expectations of what this community would be, that it would be inclusive, anti-bigotry, and I think that was a big part of why people felt welcome there and why it grew. Yeah. So in conclusion, why Bitsy? Why did this project resonate with people when other things I'd made in the past hadn't? It's hard to know. Like I said, there's some level of luck. There's a lot of different factors, but I will say, like, it makes sense that other people shared some of my similar frustrations with maybe having some trouble wanting to make a game, but having trouble getting it out on paper. I also think it helps that Bitsy runs in a web browser. So any computer, any phone can load the editor, can play the games. You don't need to download or install anything. So that gets rid of some barriers to entry. No programming is required or other specialized knowledge. So beginners can pick it up and make something that works immediately. I also think that HTML export feature I mentioned was super important, the one I borrowed from Twine, because that meant your game could be hosted on your personal website, or you could put it on other hosting services, or you could put it on itch, which itself quickly became sort of the main repository of Bitsy games on the web. I also think that the constraints were appealing. The low-res pixel art and the short piece of text sort of forced people to put aside perfectionism. You're not going to make a huge AAA game, and it gives people, I think, some permission to experiment, because you can make something small, and there's this context for this kind of smaller, more experimental work where other folks making similar games value creative use of space and dialogue, and that's what they're interested in, not necessarily labor-intensive polish or expensive graphics. And then I mentioned how the community that the Bitsy folk built in Discord, on itch, and on Twitter really made people feel welcome and part of the community, and like it was a safe space where bigotry wouldn't be tolerated, where you could learn to make games in a welcoming and safe environment. And so those are some of my ideas about why people took to Bitsy. I do want to mention another interesting idea, which is that from a talk, an essay by Emily Reed called Game Art Tools, where she writes about mass art tools. And I think Bitsy kind of became a mass art tool for many people, by which I mean, I'll just quote from Emily's talk: to call tools that embody this attitude accessible or easy or indie homogenizes them. Instead, I call them mass art tools. I use mass art not to describe work that is made and distributed at scale or popular or well advertised, in the sense that Susan Sontag used it. She observed that in the 1970s, photography has become almost as widely practiced in amusement as sex and dancing, which means that, like every mass art form, photography is not practiced by most people as an art. Basically meaning, like, people are using it for all sorts of things, not just something you put in a gallery, but also a way to just communicate person to person. And you'll see in the next section examples. So we're getting to our delicious stew. What did people make with Bitsy? They made Bitsy games, of course, but the simpler answer is they made way more than I could have imagined. Well, let's talk about the game's worlds and stories first. This is a recent screenshot from the Made with Bitsy page on itch. There are now more than 6,000 games in this category, and you usually see anywhere from 10 to 30 new games made a week. And these games include, all kinds of things. Like I said, games, worlds, stories, series of games, demakes of games people like, poems, memoirs and personal stories, games with queer themes that you often wouldn't see in the mainstream. Sometimes people will make flipbook animations or use Bitsy to even create photo albums or tell jokes or make shit posts. Some are essays, some are manifestos or birthday cards. There's scary games, funny games, sad games, just an astounding variety. And I'll just quickly go through a few examples. We've got Onion Detective 2 by Onion. which is the second in a series of mystery games made with Bitsy. This is Ballad of the Space Whale by David Mowat, which is a demake of Link's Awakening, which I mentioned earlier in the talk. Flirting by Josie Breckner is a game about non-binary folks in mechs flirting, as the title suggests. Cloud Watching by Violet is kind of a meditative, poetic game that uses photos of clouds, which are then converted into Bitsy rooms as the art. Not Seafoam by Katie Coop is a game that's kind of an essay on queer themes in Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. Aaron's Birthday Quest by Sound Dole is a birthday game made for their partner's birthday. And My Personal Manifesto for Making Games by Beckel Spinax is exactly what it sounds like. It is a manifesto about their approach to making games. And so you can see there's just this wide variety of games. But actually go beyond just simple, or what I expected people to make, individual Bitsy games, to things way beyond what I expected. First of all, the Bitsy community, the Bitsy folk figured out how to make collaborative games. Even though Bitsy was really intended just for one single author, they were able to coordinate via Bitscord and Google Sheets, and even created specialized tools such as Bitsy Merge by Sean LeBlanc, which is used to combine game data. The Bitsy Mystery Dungeon is a notable example, but there are others. And people remixed Bitsy game data. This is another project by Sean LeBlanc. It's a Twitter bot that generates Bitsy sprites and posts them along with their game data so you can use them in your own game. And people mashed up Bitsy with other game engines. This is a screenshot from Super Lunary by Freya C, which combines Bitsy with Twine in an amazing fashion. There were tutorials and other community learning resources. This is a Bitsy tutorial by Claire Morwood, which was kind of the de facto standard way to learn how to use Bitsy for a long while, and is still very popular, I believe. And like I mentioned, the international nature of the Bitsy community, but the Bitsy folk who spoke other languages besides English took it upon themselves to volunteer to help me make Bitsy work for other languages and translate it. This is a screenshot of the Bitsy editor in Arabic, for example. And the Bitsy community also put on shows and took Bitsy to exhibitions, take it out there into the world. This is another picture from the Pixels X Cakeburst show at Baby Castles, which was a show with Bitsy games and flat games and artwork using Bitsy sprites, which where everything was done on projectors and custom arcade cabinets. It was really cool. And then I want to talk about hacks and tools. So folks who weren't satisfied with the built-in features of the engine, which to be fair are pretty limited in some ways, took it upon themselves to extend the engine. And they wrote hacks that let you add features such as dialogue choices, adding transparent backgrounds, text-to-speech, all kinds of things, and just made this available to the community to expand their games. And Sean LeBlanc organizes all that into the Bitsy Hacks repository over on GitHub. And then it was worth a shout out to the Borksy Game Hacker, which is a tool that gives you a user interface on top of these hacks. This was made by A. Yoland, and just makes it a lot easier to add hacks to your game. Another tool, Pixie, lets you take images and convert them into Bitsy tiles and rooms, which I used for some of the illustrations in this talk. And really, that's just scratching the surface on the tools. and hacks that people made. And some folks took this experimentation even further, completely forking the Bitsy engine to create whole new engines built on top of it, taking it in new directions. And these include the Bitsy HD, which gave you bigger sprites, 16 by 16 pixel sprites to work with. Bitsy Color Plus, which added multicolor sprites as well as a bunch of other features and usability tweaks. And even Bitsy 3D, which lets you create, which is a fork of Bitsy that allows you to create voxel-style games, kind of like what you see with Minecraft, that kind of style of graphics. So, as you can see, Bitsy got taken in all kinds of unexpected and amazing directions. Now I want to talk a little bit about the future of Bitsy, how I look at it now. And I call this section Ripples. This is sort of stretching the stone soup metaphor a lot, but I guess when you drop a stone in something, it makes ripples. Bitsy has been around for 6 years now, so it's worth thinking about what the future of Bitsy holds. First of all, talk a little bit about the work that's gone into maintaining Bitsy over these 6 years. It has changed a lot over this time in some ways. It started off with that one room, there's limited number of sprites, and over the years I've added updates, added animation, transitions between rooms, scriptable dialogue, multiple rooms. That was a big update early on. Yeah, and most recently this year, I added a music editor and a documentation system, which was a collaboration with Sean LeBlanc and Claire Morwood, both of whom I mentioned earlier in the talk. Throughout this, I've tried to listen to the needs of the community, both by being there and talking to folks, and also playing games and seeing what people are trying to make with Bitsy. And it's an interesting give and take and collaborative experience where this little thing I made just grew so much bigger and was shaped from the beginning by the other people who are using it. One anecdote about it being shaped by users and other people in the community is what this GIF illustrates. So there's this bug in Bitsy where if you make a really long word, it overflows and creates this interesting glitchy effect in the text box. And I accidentally fixed it in one update, and I had this huge outcry from people who were like, no, I needed that. This has become a signature way of making this interesting effect in Bitsy. And so ever since then, I've made sure to check with each update that this bug is still there. And I think that's a fun illustration of the process of working on something like this. Yeah. A couple other things to mention. So preservation and resilience. This is a topic I've been thinking about a lot, with Bitsy having been around for 6 years, with there being so many games. Game preservation, it's a tricky thing, and it's not always something that the industry as a whole has prioritized. I think I often think about how Flash was such a fundamental way of playing games when I was a kid, and then it kind of was sacrificed at the altar of progress, and now it's quite hard to play old Flash games again, even though people are working really hard on preservation projects. So I want to do my part to try and set Bitsy up for success in this area. It helps that it's open source, of course, but I've also been working on a project to abstract the lower layer of Bitsy into a relatively simple set of APIs that my goal is for it to not be too much work to implement for other platforms. And this screenshot here is actually Bitsy running on a Raspberry Pi in my own desktop implementation of these APIs, which I call Bitsy-box. And this is a very early days project. I still haven't settled on the final APIs, but my hope for this is that it'll be something other people can pick up and use to port Bitsy and Bitsy games to other systems and platforms beyond the browser. So that's something I'm thinking about with the relation to Bitsy's future. Another really awesome development is the rise of a new generation of game engines that take Bitsy as a point of inspiration. And these Bitsy-like engines, they're not using the code of Bitsy at all, but they're taking the basic ideas of Bitsy and then taking it into their own direction. Some of these include Mosey by SG, which is a mobile optimized Bitsy-like focused on a world map instead of discrete rooms. Bitsy by Candle, who I also mentioned earlier. And Bitsy is focused, it's hackable by default. So it's taking kind of the lessons of the Bitsy hacks that sort of organically grew around Bitsy and incorporating those. And there are others as well. Binksy, which combines Bitsy with the Ink scripting language. There's Pulp, which is a Bitsy-like engine for Playdate. And I think there may be some more out there as well. So I think, thinking back to the beginning of my talk and about the inspirations that influenced Bitsy with tools like Twine, I think it's just hugely gratifying and inspiring to me to see other people inspired by my own little engine and taking that in their own personal and weird and creative directions. And so I want to leave you with a few thoughts about game engines. So I made a little Bitsy game for everyone here called In Praise of Weird Game Engines. And I'll just play that for you. In praise of weird game engines. A game engine is whatever you need to make your game. The best game engine is the tool you have at hand. Sometimes a game engine is software. Sometimes a game engine is chalk and a sidewalk. Sometimes a game engine is MS Paint. Sometimes a game engine is a daydream. You may hear that making an engine is a waste of time. Is carving a fork a waste of time? Is petting a cat a waste of time? Is watching steam rise off your cup of tea a waste of time? You can make a game engine in an afternoon. You can spend your whole life making a game engine. You can never make a game engine. Weird game engines say it's okay to write a poem, not an epic. Weird game engines say write a punk song, not an opera. Weird game engines are particular. Make a game engine only for fishing minigames. Make a game engine for recreating your neighborhood. Make a game engine for yourself and share it with no one. Make a game engine for yourself and share it with everyone. Make more weird game engines. And that's that. Yeah, and here are a few, certainly not an exhaustive list, but a few weird game engines that I love, like Twine, Pico 8, Mosey, Bitsy, WarioWare DIY, RPG Maker, Puzzle Script, GB Studio, and perhaps yours in the future. So that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I'll now open it up for questions.
Thank you, Adam, for such an amazing talk. It's such a kind of a, I guess, a rabbit hole of different kinds of weird small game engines, and we just know very little of those. I didn't know a lot of the things that you listed that has been kind of a variance of Bitsy, so it was really lovely to hear that. We have time for questions, so if somebody in the audience or in the chat wants to shout out a question, just prepare for one. I have one. So how many Bitsy games have you created, Adam, yourself so far?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, it's going to be about 24, something like 24 games, I'd say, over the last 6 years. Yeah, I made one recently, just a few weeks ago. We were suffering from some terrible wildfire smoke that settled over Seattle, and I just made a little game that kind of expressed my angry feelings about that. Yeah.
So that's the most recent then.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I guess the most recent is the one I just played for y'all since I made that today.
How long did that take for you to create?
That took me about 30, 45 minutes, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. So if somebody in the audience wants to have a question, just raise your hand and we'll give you the mic. There was a question from the students before this lecture, for instance, that what are the next features that you're planning to put on Bitsy? Or is it enough to kind of let the community to just take on the next steps?
That is a really good question. And to be honest, I don't know the answer just yet. I will say, like, I try not to rush into making new Bitsy features because I think, like I mentioned before, that the limitations themselves can be inspiring and get you thinking creatively about solving problems. And I think it starts to become overwhelming when you have the whole kitchen sink, you know, in your game engine. And so one of the things I often think about when working on Bitsy is what not to include, just as much as what to include. And I try to keep the features that I add to be things that are the most Bitsy-like, for lack of a better word. And keep it true to its small spirit. You know, I haven't necessarily always succeeded, but yeah, I do my best. And yeah, I guess the answer, unfortunately, is I'm not sure yet what the next features for Bitsy will be.
It's definitely a different kind of a chore to do when the bug can be a feature. So you have to plan for the community. Yeah. So I think that we have time for one question if there's someone in the audience. But if not, we will thank Adam for this wonderful talk and hopefully get you to Finland one day in person. So thank you,
Yeah,
Adam.
I'd love to do that. I'd love to come visit. But in the meantime, thank you so much for having me here virtually. It was really a pleasure to speak and be an honor, honestly, to be invited.
Yeah, we're gonna go and grab all those 6,000 games and check our favorites. So big applause for Adam. An amazing work with Bitsy.